You saved me. You brought me honor.
You saved me too. You gave me a reason to fight.
Cowboy found a woman in his barn and gave her shelter, never knowing she'd change his fate forever. In the late autumn of 1881, the sun over Texas refused to cool. Though the almanac called it fall, Dry Creek felt like the inside of a furnace, the ground scorched into brittle powder. Dust clung to the air so thick a man could taste it, bitter as gunmetal, burning the back of his throat with every breath. The town reeked of sweat and cattle hide, of whiskey spilled too often on cracked planks, and of loneliness dressed up as commerce. At the edge of the general store, where the shadows stretched long and thin across the dirt road, stood Silas Carrion. He was 35, but the desert sun had aged him into something older, the kind of man carved by drought and silence. His shoulders were square, not from pride but from years of shouldering work that never ended, mending fences, burying cattle after dry spells, and carrying memories no one else wanted to claim. His boots were worn raw at the seams, caked with the red clay of his homestead, every step silent as if he belonged to the dust itself. Silas had come to town for supplies, salt, flour, maybe a few nails. He had not come for voices or company. He had not come to remember he was still a man and not yet a ghost. But his solitude was about to break. Near the final corral, something caught his eye, a shape that did not belong to any horse or steer. A girl. She could not have been more than 19. A rope tied her wrist to the thick hand of a drunk, a man whose face was lost under the brim of a hat and the stench of cheap whiskey. The bottle swayed as he spoke, his words tumbling out like rocks down a canyon wall. Her dress was torn, the hem hanging ragged. Her bare feet were cut and bruised, dirt ground deep into skin that should have known only softness. But it was not the ruin of her body that held Silas, it was her eyes. They were startlingly clear, like a pool of water hidden deep in the canyon, eyes that fixed on him with a calm that made his throat tighten. There was no screaming, no begging, no thrashing against the rope, just a depth that reached for him, a mirror to the loneliness he had carried like a stone for half his life. And friends, if you're listening to this and love Wild West love stories, do me a favor, comment the number 1 and type your place down below. Let's see where all my Wild West love folks are tuning in from tonight. The drunk spat into the dust, pulling the girl forward like she was nothing more than extra weight on his hand. His voice was a slurred insult to the quiet afternoon. "Got a dumb one here," he barked, holding up the rope like a prize. "She don't talk, don't hear neither. She comes with the mare." He slapped the flank of a trembling bay horse beside him, its ribs sharp as fence rails under skin stretched too thin. Laughter rose from a few men leaning on the rails of the corral, sharp as barbed wire. To them it was spectacle, another cruel joke the frontier was so fond of. Silas stood still, his jaw tightening. His first instinct was to turn away. He had learned long ago that trouble always dressed itself in someone else's tragedy. He needed no part in this, no reminder that the world still had teeth. He had come for a horse, not for pain, not for someone else's burden. Yet the girl's gaze pinned him where he stood. She said nothing, could say nothing, if the drunk was to be believed, but in that silence was an unspoken plea. Her eyes told him she had known hunger and fear, had been dragged across too many miles by too many cruel hands. But more than that, her eyes told him she recognized him, not his face, not his name, but the hollow place inside him. And in that instant, the memories he had fought to bury clawed their way back. He remembered another pair of eyes, Daniel's, his friend, dying in a field of fire and smoke, whispering his last breath into Silas's ear. He remembered the war, the prison, the chains. He remembered the promise he had broken, the weight of guilt so heavy it had driven him into the desert to die alone. The girl's silence was Daniel's silence. Her brokenness was his. Silas took a step forward. His boots scuffed the dust, the sound like a shot in the brittle quiet. The drunk man sneered. "You interested, cowboy? She ain't worth much, but neither's the horse. You buy the mare, the girl comes with it. Can't get rid of her no other way." Silas's hand clenched into a fist. He could almost feel the world splitting open, his quiet life crumbling at the edges. He had spent years trying to escape the noise, the blood, the endless clawing demands of other people. But the desert had lied. Solitude was no refuge. It had only made his soul louder. He looked once more into the girl's eyes. She did not flinch. She did not beg. She simply waited, steady as a stone, as though she already knew the choice he was going to make. And in that moment, Silas Carrion understood. Whether he wanted it or not, his life would never be the same again. The dust of Dry Creek swirled in tiny spirals, rising and vanishing with the shifting wind. For the rest of the town, the day would pass like any other, another auction, another cruel bargain sealed with whiskey and laughter. But for Silas, the world tilted. He felt the ground shift beneath his boots, as though the desert itself had chosen to drag him back into the fight he thought he had left behind. He saw in that girl not weakness but defiance, a refusal to vanish, even when everything around her tried to erase her. And for a man who had lived as a ghost for too long, that spark cut through him sharper than any blade. He did not yet know her name. He did not know the miles she had walked barefoot, the nights she had hidden from hands rougher than stone, the words she had never spoken. But he knew enough. Silas Carrion took another step forward, and as the sun bled into the horizon, stretching long shadows across the dust-choked town, the first fragile threads of a story began to weave between two broken souls, a story the desert itself would not forget. The sun rose the next morning, though it seemed reluctant, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to shed light on the cabin that had turned into a tomb of quiet. Its golden rays filtered through the cracks in the rough-hewn boards, illuminating dust motes that drifted like slow, patient ghosts. Outside, the desert was already awake, the call of a hawk overhead, the creak of dry wood as the wind worried at the porch. But inside, the air was heavy, thick with silence, so deep it pressed against the chest like stone. She didn't speak, and I didn't push her. Words felt fragile in that cabin, like glass that might shatter if touched too roughly. I set down a plate of cornbread, hard but edible, and a tin cup of water. She accepted them with a slow, cautious nod, her thin fingers trembling as if every small motion carried the weight of memory. Her eyes dark, bottomless, a canyon no man could cross, held a story I didn't want to hear. Some tales, I had learned, kill you twice, once in the living and once in the telling. She was Apache. I could tell from the cut of her clothes, the soft leather worn with use, the stitchwork meant not for show but for survival. A single turquoise earring glinted faintly in the morning light, a lone shard of beauty amid ruin. That stone cut me deeper than any knife could. My heart ached for her, though I did not know her name, though I did not know the path that had led her into my cabin like a wounded bird. And in that ache came the memory of Daniel. His voice rose in my head, quiet, steady, always urging me to look for the humanity in the enemy, even when every instinct told me to see only the rifle in his hand. I had failed him in the mud and fire, failed him in the smoke and blood, failed him when his last breath had slipped through my fingers like water. Now here was another test, another soul cast into my path, and I felt the old wound tear itself open. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. Her name, I learned later, was Nijoni, meaning beautiful in her tongue. She spoke it soft, like a secret torn from the dark, her lips trembling as though the word itself was dangerous. Nijoni spent her days huddled near the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames with an intensity that unsettled me. It was as if she searched in those shifting embers for a memory, or perhaps a piece of herself that had been stolen. I kept my distance, working the land, hammering new boards into the fence posts, patching the roof that the last dust storm had nearly torn away. Yet every so often my eyes betrayed me, wandering back to her as she sat cross-legged on the floor, her hands clasped tightly, her face bathed in firelight. Each glance carved at me, stirred an ache I could not name. She was not mine, not my kin, not my burden, yet her silence was a mirror to my own. The more I watched, the more details revealed themselves. I saw the brand on her arm, a crude scar burned into flesh that should have never known such cruelty. The sight hollowed me. My hand rose without thought to my own chest, to the brand invisible to all but myself, the mark of failure I had carried since that battlefield where Daniel had fallen. Two broken things, she and I, caught in the same ruinous orbit. We were not friends, not yet companions, but the silence between us formed an alliance forged in pain, unspoken and undeniable. I knew I could not keep her. I was no guardian, no savior. I was a man running from his past, barely keeping his own shadow at bay. I told her I would take her to town, to the nearest doctor, where perhaps she could be safe, where someone else could carry the burden she represented. But the moment the words left my mouth, her eyes widened. A sudden, silent panic filled them, raw and wild. She shook her head violently. Her gaze begged, pleaded without sound. She could not go back, not to the world of men who had used and broken her, not to the cruel hands that had branded her like cattle. In her eyes, I saw the terror of a young foal caught in barbed wire, bleeding and thrashing against a world that had no mercy. And I knew I could not send her away, that my quiet life, my fragile illusion of solitude, was over. To protect her meant breaking every rule I had sworn by, meant turning to face the demons I had run from for too many years. But choice had slipped from my hands the moment she walked into my cabin. We left the next morning. The sun rose in a blaze of fire, the horizon bleeding orange and red, as though the sky itself knew a storm was coming. I had my rifle strapped to my saddle. She had her silence, her quiet strength. Together, we were two lone riders against a desert vast enough to swallow us whole. We rode 2 days, our words few, our silence thick but not unwelcome. Now and then I felt her gaze on me, steady, unflinching, carrying with it a gratitude that cracked the shell of my heart. It made my chest ache, that look. For the first time in years, I felt not entirely alone. We were not yet family, not yet bound by love, but we were tethered by something older, something fiercer, survival. On the 3rd day, the wind changed. I saw at first a cloud of dust on the horizon, a smear against the endless blue sky. Riders, a dozen at least, moving with precision, not the careless meandering of cowhands, but the cold efficiency of wolves on a hunt. My stomach turned to stone. I knew that kind of riding. And then I saw him, at the head of the pack, tall, broad-shouldered, sitting astride a black horse, as though the beast itself carried his malice, was a face I had prayed never to see again. Silas Blackwood. My blood froze, my pulse hammered. Memories I had chained to the deepest pit of my mind tore free. Blackwood, the devil dressed in dust and iron, the man who had betrayed Daniel and me, who had traded honor for gold, who had sold his soul for power, a vulture who had feasted on men's trust and spat their bones into the sand. Now he was here, and he was hunting her. I turned to Najoni. My throat was dry, my voice little more than gravel. "We have to run," I rasped. Her eyes locked on mine. No panic this time, only fire. And then she spoke, her voice soft, melodic, like a river running through stone canyons. It was the first time I had heard her words clear, and they struck me harder than any bullet. "We will run," she said, "but they will not catch us." I stared at her, stunned by the steel hidden beneath her quiet, and in that moment, I believed her. We were no longer two broken things drifting in silence. We were a storm waiting to break. We would not be caught. We would fight. The canyon walls rose around us like a fortress carved by some ancient hand, sheer cliffs of rust-colored stone that glowed under the unforgiving sun. The air was stifling, still and heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Yes, we were trapped, but so were they. The canyon had no mercy for fools, and I had spent too long studying its cruel ways to miss the advantage. I swung down from the saddle, my boots sinking into the soft grit of the canyon floor. My rifle slid free from its scabbard with a sound as familiar as my own heartbeat, the weight of it anchoring me. My heart hammered against my ribs, steady but loud, each beat reminding me this was not a dream, not some fevered memory of the past. This was real, and death was close. Najoni slipped from her horse with a grace that made me pause. She was silence made flesh, her movements as fluid and sure as a cat weaving through the dark. There was no fear in her eyes, only the sharpened edge of resolve. She carried herself not like a girl on the run, but like a warrior preparing for the moment she had always known would come. I pressed my back to a boulder as tall as a man, the stone hot against my spine. From here, I could see the rim of the canyon, shadows shifting where danger waited to reveal itself. Nijoni knelt beside me, her dark hair falling across her cheek as she fixed her gaze on the path we had taken. Her breathing was calm, deliberate, like the desert wind when it slides low and cold across the sand at night. "They are close," she whispered. Her voice was low, melodic, a murmur that seemed to blend with the canyon itself. "They will not stop." I closed my eyes for the briefest moment, the truth of her words heavy in my chest. She was right. Silas Blackwood was not a man who gave up. He was a predator, a man who would follow you to the ends of the earth if it meant adding another coin to his blood-soaked purse. "Why are they after you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a rasp. Her head turned, her eyes meeting mine. They were bottomless, old in a way that did not belong to 19 summers. "My father," she said, the words weighted with grief so sharp it might have been a blade. "He would not sell the land. He would not sell his people. Silas wanted the land, the silver buried in its bones. He killed my father." The words struck me harder than any bullet. For a moment, I could not breathe. The canyon tilted, shadows lengthening, as if the land itself mourned with her. Silas. Always Silas. The same man who had sold out my men for a sack of gold. The same man who had stood by while Daniel bled into the dirt. The same man who had turned loyalty into currency, who had left me hollow and broken. And now, here he was again, chasing this girl, this last fragment of her people's honor, for nothing more than greed. Rage rose in me pure, unflinching, terrible in its clarity. It seared away the fear, the regret, the self-pity I had carried like chains. In its place was something cleaner, something harder. I was no longer running from my past. I was running toward it. Nijoni's gaze did not waver. She studied me as though weighing whether the man beside her was worthy of her story. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but unbreakable. "My people have a saying, the mountain will always remember the injustice." Her words carved themselves into me, as permanent as a scar. She told me of the sacred land, the mesas that held the bones of her ancestors, the canyons where her people had prayed, hunted, lived, and died for generations. She spoke of her father, a chief of dignity and pride, who had faced Silas with nothing but honor in his hands, and how Silas had struck him down all the same. I listened, each word drumming in my chest like war beats. This was not the tale of a helpless victim. This was the song of a survivor, a girl who had lost everything but not her fire. I looked at her, at the dirt streaking her face, at the raw wound seeping through her sleeve, and in her I saw the reflection of my own ruin. Two scarred souls, broken in different battles, but carrying the same weight of injustice. I knew then what I had to do. This was not about saving her alone. This was about saving myself, saving the sliver of honor I had thought long dead. This canyon, this sun, this moment, it was my last chance at redemption. The sun blazed overhead, its heat turning the stone walls into shimmering veils of fire. Sweat traced paths down my back, but I did not move. Then we heard it, the clatter of hooves on stone, echoing like distant thunder. Men cursed under their breath, the sound of frustration betraying their unease. They knew they were in a bad position, boxed in by cliffs that could betray them at any moment. And then came his voice. "Silas Blackwood." "John." His rasp slithered across the canyon walls, slick and cold as oil. "I know you're in there. Give me the girl, and I'll let you go. You and I were not so different." No. His words scraped against my ears like rusted iron. Not so different. He was wrong. Dead wrong. He was a man who took, who stole, who betrayed, who killed for his own gain. And I, after all the running, after all the years of shame, had finally decided to give. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, Do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. I shifted my grip on the rifle, feeling the worn grooves of the stock, each one a mark of years I could not erase. My mouth was dry, my heartbeat steady, a drum counting down to the moment the first shot would split the silence. Nizoni crouched beside me, her gaze steady on the canyon mouth. She did not tremble, she did not cry. She was stone, fire, and wind all at once. And beside her I found a strength I had forgotten was mine. The canyon was no longer a prison, it was a crucible. And as the sun blazed overhead, as Silas's men drew closer, as the shadows grew long and sharp, I knew this fight was not just about land or silver, not just about vengeance. It was about the mountain remembering, about the desert keeping its promise, about two broken souls daring to stand their ground against a world that had tried to erase them. The sun hung like a coin of fire in the sky, suspended in the late afternoon haze, bleeding its light across the ridges of red stone. Heat shimmered in wavering waves along the canyon floor, each ripple bending the world as if the desert itself wanted to distort what was about to happen. The silence was deceptive, for beneath it was the steady drum of approaching violence, the kind of silence a man only hears before blood spills into the dust. I stepped out from behind the boulder, my rifle hanging loose at my side, though my hand was tight upon the worn grip. My voice, when it came, was as dry and cracked as the desert wind. Silas. He stood in the open, the black stallion beneath him restless, stamping its hooves against the parched earth. The men flanking him shifted uneasily, their eyes on me, their hands already brushing the butts of their guns. But Silas did not move. He smiled, slow and cruel, a thin slash across a face carved by greed and the years of betrayal that had defined him. "I'm not giving her to you," I said, my words simple, final, without room for negotiation. Silas tilted his head, as though amused at a child's defiance. "John," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery, "you always were a fool for a lost cause. You think this one will be any different? I'll give you one chance. My last warning, hand her over, and you can ride away, free." He was trying to tempt me, appealing not to the man I had become, but to the coward he believed still lived inside me, the man who had run from his past, from the memory of Daniel's last breath, from honor itself. He expected me to bend, as I once had. But that man was gone. I looked at him, at the man who had cost me my brother, who had turned loyalty into ashes. A cold clarity settled over me, sharper than any blade. "I'm not a fool, Silas," I said. The words were steady, each one a nail driven into the coffin of the man I had been. "I'm a man who's finally found his honor." For the first time, I saw it, the smirk faltering, surprise flickering across his face like a shadow of doubt. He had expected fear. He had expected me to cower. Instead, he found a man who had nothing left to lose, a man whose soul had already walked through fire and come out scarred, but unbroken. Silas raised his hand, a silent signal. His men fanned out like vultures circling carrion, each step kicking up small clouds of dust. Their boots scraped against the canyon floor, guns gleaming under the dying sun. But what they did not know was that this canyon belonged to me now. Years of solitude had taught me to read the desert as another man reads scripture. I knew the shifts in the wind, the tremors in the earth, the hidden cracks in stone that could turn into cover or death. This was my altar, and they had walked into it blind. The first shot tore through the silence. I returned fire, my rifle bucking against my shoulder, the sound ringing sharp and merciless off the canyon walls. A lifetime of muscle memory surged through me. The rhythm of survival, the stance, the breath, the squeeze of the trigger came back as though I had never laid it down. Dust rose in choking waves, smoke curling into the harsh light. The world became a blur of echoes, of gunfire cracking like thunder, of bodies shifting through the storm of sand. I moved through it like a man possessed, like a ghost called back to a dance he had sworn never to perform again. My boots slid across loose rock, my coat catching in the wind. Each shot was deliberate, each step calculated. One man dropped, another cried out, the desert swallowing his scream. And through it all, I heard her. Nizoni, hidden in the shadowed crevice of the canyon wall, Her voice rose, low and steady, a chant woven from centuries. It was a prayer to her ancestors, a song of war carried on the wind. Her words were foreign, but their meaning was not. They wrapped around me, a rhythm older than rifles, older than greed. She was no longer the silent, wounded girl I had found. In that moment, she was a warrior, a ghost of her people, fighting beside me with her spirit. I took down 2 of Silas's men, my rifle an unforgiving extension of my will. Each fall was not victory, but necessity, a grim step in the march I had chosen. Silas watched from atop his horse, his eyes wide now, no longer amused but cold with fury. He had come for an easy victory, for a simple capture. Instead, he had found a man who had returned from the grave of his past, carrying with him a will sharpened by pain. "This isn't over, John," he screamed, his voice ragged, tearing at the still air. "I'll find you. I'll hunt you down, and when I do, I'll end you." I smiled a grim, humorless curve of my lips that held no joy, only truth. "No, Silas," I said. My voice was calm, like the summer breeze that follows the storm. "I'm the one who's going to find you." The words broke him. His fury twisted into something close to fear. He jerked his gun, raising it too fast, too desperate. But I was already there. My final shot cracked the canyon air, echoing against the cliffs, reverberating like judgment itself. I watched him fall. The black stallion reared, screaming, as Silas's body crumpled into the red dust, a heap of broken flesh and shattered pride. His blood seeped into the earth, dark against the stone, claimed by the desert that had borne witness to too many deaths. I did not feel triumph, only a hollow ache. I had not just defeated a man, I had defeated the ghost of my past. I had not just fired a bullet, I had fired the weight of years, of failure, of a promise broken on a battlefield. And as his body stilled, I felt that ghost lift at last, leaving me with nothing but silence. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. I lowered my rifle, the barrel smoking faintly, heat still curling from its steel. My breath came hard, but my hands were steady. I had not just survived. I had reclaimed a piece of myself long buried under dust and regret. The canyon fell quiet once more. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint whisper of Najoni's chant as it faded into silence. She stepped from the shadows, her eyes fixed on me. In them I saw not fear, not pity, but something stronger, a recognition, a bond carved by fire and blood. We were no longer 2 lost souls adrift, no longer shadows circling in the desert with no anchor, no purpose. We had chosen to fight, to stand, to bleed if it came to that. And though the world around us lay shattered and cruel, though every canyon and mesa carried the weight of sorrow and the scars of injustice, here, in this place where the rocks glowed red with the last fire of day, I found it, the first fragile ember of honor glowing in the ashes of my life. I walked slowly across the desert floor, each step sinking deep into the loose sand, as if the earth itself wanted to claim me, to drag me down where so many other men had fallen. My boots scraped against stone and gravel, and in that sound I heard an elegy, the dirge of a life spent chasing shadows. The smell of gunpowder still lingered thick in the air, acrid and sharp, biting the back of my throat, clinging to my tongue. It mixed with the iron tang of blood and the dust of centuries. The wind had gone still, utterly still, as though the desert itself had bowed its head in mourning, or perhaps in judgment. Silence pressed down on me, heavy as a millstone. It was not peace. It was the hush that follows slaughter, when the land itself recoils from what it has witnessed. When I reached him, I stopped. Silas lay sprawled in the sand, his limbs crooked, his body broken. His chest no longer rose, no breath stirred his lips. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that had haunted my nights for a decade, stared unblinking at the vast, indifferent sky. The sun blazed above him, merciless and eternal, stripping the last heat from his corpse, as if eager to erase every trace of life from a man who had already surrendered himself to greed and betrayal long ago. His life so violent, so ruthless, a long ledger of sin had ended here, swallowed by the same dust he had spilled so much blood upon. And staring down at him, I felt no triumph. No surge of righteous victory coursed through me. No relief. What I felt was emptiness. It was the kind of emptiness that comes after a storm has howled for too long, tearing down every tree, every roof, every fragile thing in its path. When it passes, the quiet it leaves is not gentle. It is exhaustion. It is hollow, a silence that swallows even memory, leaving behind nothing but ruin. I looked into those glassy eyes, into that face frozen in death, and instead of anger, I saw only tragedy. Silas Blackwood had been devoured by his own choices, a man who had clawed so hard for power that he had consumed himself in the process. Once, he had fought with honor, stood with brothers. Once, he had believed in something greater than gold, but he had long since turned himself into the very thing he swore he hated: a predator, a vulture. And now he was nothing at all. The ghost of Daniel stirred in my chest. For years, his voice had haunted me, his last breath replaying in my head, a wound that never closed. I had carried that failure like a brand seared into my flesh, every day a reminder that I had not been strong enough to save him, that I had been a coward when it mattered most. But now, with Silas lying lifeless in the sand, that ghost finally lifted from my shoulders. The chain that had bound me broke. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling the weight of the dead pressing on my lung. I holstered my gun slowly, deliberately, the steel cold against my hip. It was a steady, familiar weight, the only constant in a life made of shifting shadows and broken promises. I had done what needed to be done. Perhaps I had done what I should have done long ago, before so many graves had been filled. It did not make me proud, but it left me lighter. It felt like paying a debt I had owed to the earth, to Daniel, to myself, for far too long. When I turned, I saw her. Nijoni emerged from behind the boulders, her steps cautious but sure. The fire that had burned in her eyes during the fight was still there, but now it was softened by something that stole the breath from my lungs: gratitude. Her hair clung to her face in the sweat and dust, her clothes torn, her arms still streaked with blood, yet she walked with dignity, with grace. She looked at me as though I had shifted the world itself. "You saved me," she whispered. Her voice was soft, melodic, fragile as water slipping into dry soil. "You brought me honor." Those words cut deeper than any wound I had ever taken. For so long, my heart had been nothing but a lump of coal, blackened, brittle, useless under the crushing weight of regret. But now, at her words, something stirred. It glowed faintly with warmth, faintly with hope. "You saved me too," I said. My voice cracked on the confession, but I did not care. The truth does not always come clean. "You gave me a reason to fight." Her lips trembled, her eyes glistened with unshed tears in the dying light. For a moment, the desert disappeared. For a moment, there was only her and me and the raw, impossible miracle that we were still standing. Two shattered people in a shattered world. But for the first time, neither of us was alone. We were more than survivors. We were a story, a cowboy love story etched in blood and silence, a tale of two souls who had found each other in the raw heart of Wild West love. I had been a man who lost everything: land, brotherhood, even the will to live, but in the eyes of an Apache girl, I had found something I thought had died forever: a home. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. We buried Silas in the desert, though to call it a burial was too kind. The sand was shallow, the grave unmarked. We set no stone, no cross, no words. The desert claimed him, as it had claimed so many before him. It was fitting. A man who had lived without honor deserved no marker, no memory. His story ended here, in silence, carried away by the wind. When it was done, we mounted our horses. The sun had begun to sink low, dragging streaks of fire across the horizon, deep orange, blood red, purple as bruised skin. The desert glowed with its last light, as though the land itself burned with memory. We rode side by side. Our shadows stretched long across the sand, two figures bound together not by chance, but by choice. We did not know where we were going. There was no plan, no map, no promise of safe passage. But for the first time in years, it did not matter. The past was behind us, buried in an unmarked grave. The future lay before us like an endless road, uncertain but open, waiting for us to carve our path into it. The wind rose gently, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of sage. Nizoni's hair lifted, catching the last fire of the sun, her profile etched against the light as though carved into eternity. I looked at her, and in that glance, I felt something bloom in me, fragile but unyielding. Hope. We were two souls bound by pain, two warriors carved by loss. Yet together we were more than the sum of our scars. We were Wild West, love itself, fragile and fierce, born not of ease but of fire. A man and a woman, broken and remade, who had chosen to ride into the unknown together. Our journey was not ending, it was beginning. Ahead lay dangers still. Outlaws, bandits, the cruelty of the land itself. But for the first time in years, I was not afraid. Whatever came, we would face it as one. We rode into the fading light, the sky above us, a canvas of flame. The desert stretched infinite and merciless, but it no longer felt like exile. It felt like possibility, for I carried not just a rifle at my side, but the steady rhythm of her presence beside me. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment AMEN below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life. The desert night crept in slow and patient, shadows swallowing the last light. Stars pierced the velvet sky one by one, until the heavens were full of them, glittering cold and eternal. Two riders moved steadily forward, two spirits, two halves of a whole, pressing on into the unknown. And for the first time, I did not feel lost.
You're free. You choose where you go.
I'm free, aren't I?
They laughed at the price of the wounded Navajo woman, until a cowboy paid more and silenced the town. The dust came alive in Copper Bend. Not just a thin layer of grit, but a living, breathing thing that coated your teeth and salted your sweat. I rode in slow, the kind of pace a man keeps when he's got no good reason to hurry, and every good reason to watch his back. My name's Caleb Shaw. It's a name that sits a little heavy on me. A bit like the past I'd been riding away from for 5 long years. But the past has a way of catching up, especially in towns like this. I'd come for flour and coffee, nothing more. A simple man with simple needs, or so I told myself. A self-inflicted lie I'd been trying to believe since the day I rode out of Fort Defiance, my soul heavier than my saddlebags. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey and unwashed men, and then I heard it, the laughter. It wasn't the sound of men enjoying a drink, but a sharp, ugly thing, like glass being broken. The kind of sound that told you someone's life was being shattered for sport. It twisted something inside me, a coil of rage and guilt I'd been trying to bury. I'd seen this kind of ugliness before, back when I was a soldier, and we were civilizing the West. Back when we were rounding up the Navajo and marching them to their graves, calling it manifest destiny. The ghosts of those long marches, of the people we broke and left behind, they don't fade easy. They were a constant, quiet hum under my skin, and in that moment, they were screaming. The memory of a small girl, no older than my own sister would have been, with eyes that held a sorrow too deep for a child, flashed in my mind. She was on the long walk, and I was on the other side of a rifle, watching instead of stopping it. The shame of it was a bitter taste in my mouth, one that no amount of clean mountain air had ever been able to wash away. So, when I heard that laughter, it wasn't just a sound, it was a memory, a raw, open wound that refused to heal. If you love Wild West love stories, drop one in your place in the comments for Wild West love so I know where you're listening from. I kept my hat low and my name lower. But sometimes a man's past, no matter how hard he tries to outrun it, rides up alongside him and slaps him in the face. This was one of those times. I rode closer, the the creak of my saddle a quiet protest against the noise. The crowd was a cluster of hard-faced men, a sea of grime and greed, their faces half hidden by hat brims, but their eyes full of a hunger I knew too well.